All right, so thank you all for joining us today for this discussion on Pieces of the Action, the memoir by Vannevar Bush. I'm Alaka Halder. I'm joined by Wes Chow, and today we're here to discuss both the memoir and the legacy of Bush, who was an engineer, inventor, administrator. He headed the U.S. Office of Scientific Research and Development during World War II. He catalyzed the creation of the NSF and also served as the dean of the MIT School of Engineering. He also co-founded Raytheon, the defense contractor, among many things. To kick off the discussion, we will just would like to ask everyone to do a quick intro, who are you, why are you joining us today, and just pass it off to another person in the room. So I'll just start and pick randomly. Dominic, welcome, and please introduce yourself.
Hello everyone, I'm Dominic. I'm from the United Kingdom and I am a software developer. And I was kind of interested in the book when I heard about it. I also have to admit that as I started to read it, while I found there's quite a lot of interesting stuff in it about kind of organization and innovation, that kind of thing, that the military aspect became a little more relentless than I had thought. So I haven't actually got through more than about 2.5 chapters. I'm kind of hoping that maybe I will learn some pointers from this discussion about whether certain later chapters will be more interesting than others for me personally. And so, yeah, I'm excited to see what people have to say.
Want to pass it off to someone else? Just pick someone up.
Yes, I can pass it on to Eric.
Hi, my name's Eric. I live and work in Chicago right now, and how I came to be here was I write the Free Take Substack, and what I've been doing, it's a lot of progress studies related things, and what I've been recently doing is a series on MIT, and I included a lot of bits about Vannevar Bush and how some of his opinions on things related to applied research were probably different than people would expect, and that was when Wes reached out to me and thought I would get a kick out of this today, so that's how I'm here. And I'll pass it off to Gil.
Hi, everybody. I'm Gil Pratt. I live across the street from Wes, and so that's how we got to know each other. But the reason that this is relevant to me, I went to MIT for 21 years, starting in 1979. I actually had worked at Bell Labs a little bit before then, and so I'm very interested in sort of the connection of Vannevar Bush to sort of the history of big corporate labs after the war. But then after that, I went to work for DARPA for 5.5 years, which I think is directly related to some of the work that he did and the ideas that he had. And recently, I'm the chief scientist for Toyota and head up the Toyota Research Institute. And so all of these things about, how innovation should be nurtured and sort of what the history of that was after the war is of very, very strong interest to me. With that, let me head it off to Jeremy.
Hi there. So I'm calling in from Texas. Alaka invited me here, and I'm interested in mid-century American history, especially around World War II, and Bush name comes up a lot, and I hadn't read about him deeply. I work at SpaceX and mechanical engineer there, and just heavily interested in the sort of culture of innovation that existed around mid-century, and in particular the technologies that I'm most interested in are nuclear power and launch vehicles, these sorts of things. And a lot of those have not changed that much, since the 70s, around the time that Bush is writing this book. And so I'm just kind of interested in what sort of factors in culture and organizations lead to innovation in these particular fields, and also in general in engineering fields. And how about over to Eric?
I already went, but I can pass it again. How about Parth?
Yeah, I guess he meant me.
Sorry.
Oh, right, you're right. I didn't see that.
How do you pronounce your name? Sorry.
No worries. We have the same name, but just spelled a little differently.
Yeah.
So I'm calling in from Munich, Germany. I'm a founder and have recently gotten interested in machine learning, but how I got into this call in is actually, I'm a YC founder, and when you have like a thing with Patrick Collison, any presentation, you can't have that without him mentioning the Dream Machine, this book that's really exciting. Has anybody read Dream Machine? Probably, yeah. It's just so curious, and this is what has gotten me to think about not just innovation, but actually the study of innovation or the study of progress. And the Dream Machine was such a wild ride for me, just reading it, that I ever since tried to just re-experience the same thing with other books about growth. And this book sort of had the description and the potential to do that. I haven't read any of it, and I don't quite know yet who Vannevar Bush actually is. So I've just gotten into it because it sounded interesting. And this is also my very first salon, actually. I've never participated in one before.
Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah. So Eric, who are you going to pick?
Oh, I was going to pick Parth.
Well, there you go. Let's go with Parth.
Hey, I'm Parth. I just moved to DC like a week ago, and going to be doing some of the kind of translational work here of taking some of the ideas from the meta science and progress studies communities and trying to turn them into policy changes. So like, for example, organizing a workshop with some NIH staffers and some economists of innovation to think about, what if these ideas could actually be implemented. So I'm excited to be here and just absorbing, all the good stuff you guys are talking about.
Did you want to pass it off to someone else? I think we've got a
Oh, sorry. Jorge?
Sure. Hi, guys. I'm a programmer from Colombia, joining from London. I'm interested in Vannevar Bush mostly because of the mimics, because in my company, I'm trying to build one mimics and the search engine to help people navigate the graphs that they built with it. But I'm also interested in the rest that is covered in his memoirs, because I also read Scientific Freedom, another Stripe Press book. So it's very interesting to see like how that was approached, and we still need that today. So yeah, looking forward to what you guys have to comment on it. I mostly read the chapter on inventions and inventors, which covers the mimics, but yeah, looking forward to the rest too.
Who hasn't gone yet? Andre, I think you just joined, and then James.
Hey everyone, I'm excited to come to this salon. I'm an economist. I haven't done research on innovation, but I'm interested in it, and in particular, I would like to understand progress better, and through reading books like this, I think it's an interesting perspective. I'm usually used to reading statistics papers, which are useful and important and so on, but are very narrow in certain ways. And I'm trying to expand my outlook on things. Yep.
And then we have James and Ben. You haven't gone either. So James.
Hi everyone, I'm James. I'm a software engineer in London as well. I guess I've been into this field ever since I did a book club with Entrepreneur First, the Innovator in London, on organizing genius, which was, going through the Manhattan Project and like early bits of MIT and all these like big 20th century projects. And that made into like tools of thought and as we may think. But coming into this book, I think the stuff I was really enjoying was like a lot of the political stuff and the management side of things, and that's where I felt like the perspective was standing out most to me. So keen to jump into all of that stuff. So I guess I'll hand it over to Ben, which is maybe the easiest introduction here.
Hi, I'm Ben. I I guess my main job right now is trying to start a nonprofit research organization that's kind of modeled off of DARPA. I'm interested in how we make more awesome sci-fi shit in general, and the sort of overriding hypothesis is that it's like a large question. Part of the thing that's holding it back is really institutional structures. So I'm very interested in that. I have a background in history, so I like digging up things like this book.
Awesome. We're so glad you could make it. Very excited for this discussion. Wes, I'll let you kick it off.
Yeah, so we thought, Ben, we could put you on the spot here and maybe start off with a question about the book itself and the reprint. Like, why is it happening now? Like, why is it important that we reprint this book? Like, what's the story of how it came to Stripe?
Well, so I don't know the actual story. I have a hypothesis. So I can tell you that. I also I was hoping to mostly listen because everybody knows my opinion about things. But I think the story, I mean, like, I discovered it because I was just doing research on sort of the history of the American innovation system. And so it's like, I'd just been sort of going through different books on that, and my my overriding agenda is to try to read first, like, primary sources, because I find that that's just like where you actually get the real information. And so I was like, surely there's like a Vannevar Bush biography out there somewhere, and I couldn't find one. And so I was just like searching for books about him, by him, and I found this, and it was like deeply out of print. And I like bought the last copy on Amazon. And then I published a Twitter thread about it that people really liked. And then like, according to Tammy, like, then they, like, Stripe Press bought the rights to it and sort of did that. So that's my hypothesis. It may have just been coincidence.
I just think it's fascinating that, given his influence and how many different organizations he either influenced or worked with, that he's not more well known today. And I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, what I noticed in trying to answer the question why the Memex has not been built yet is that he didn't jump ship into digital, basically. So the Memex was an analog device. And even though he saw digital coming with computers, he didn't join that revolution. I may be wrong, but I think even the book mentions that he didn't cross paths with Licklider. So they didn't know each other. And if they did, maybe he would have been part of the computer revolution as well and would have more notoriety. But even in the hypertext world, even though everyone points back to, as we may think, as the first mention of proto-hypertext, is not well known in that space either. Like, there's some pioneers that didn't know about his work, and some, like, now every app developer in the tools for thought space know about him, but for a long time, including the early days of the web, he wasn't that mentioned. So maybe it was because of that analog to digital transition that didn't happen in his career.
So the book, I believe, ends like essentially like right around the formation of the NSF, and he, explicitly did not want to run that. And does anybody know like what he continued to do after that, like from that point on? I haven't read like any Bush material like outside of this book and the Endless Frontier essay. But we might be a thoroughly unprepared group.
No, I mean, the answer is probably in the books by Pascal Zachary, the biographer, but I haven't read them yet.
Ben, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, he basically went into retirement. He kind of became a political pariah, which probably hints at why a lot of people haven't heard of him. Is like, it's like now enough sufficient time has passed that people forget that he became a political outcast, right? But I mean, he kind of alludes to it in the book of how he like didn't get along with Truman very well. And so he basically got like effectively like pushed out of the establishment.
Yeah, there's that whole episode, in the ending chapter about how he didn't know why, like essentially Truman like stopped calling on him, and he like never like learned why. He had I think maybe some theories there, but yeah, do we like, is there any more insight like about that, or because I don't know if like anyone would have like just gone up to him and like and told him this is why Truman's not calling on you.
I mean, so I didn't read this book, but I read some other Bush material. He never struck me from his MIT days as somebody with the most interpersonal political tact. Like, I'm sure he probably maybe turned it on in DC, but there are kind of accounts of him going into like Carl Compton's office at MIT. And before he even said, hey, I don't like your new policy, like just fist banging on the table and yelling at him. So I can imagine if that's in you and that's in your heart, you maybe would do that sometimes in DC. And DC is not MIT. Like, Carl Compton thought it was fun when he did that, and they had a good lively discussion and they became friends. But I can imagine if something like that happens a little bit more east, they don't take to it as kindly. So I don't know if he alludes to it or not in the book, but that seems to be the kind of thing that does get you some dislike in DC sometimes.
Yeah, and he also does allude to the fact that he kind of stayed out of political administration and that he was glad to kind of stay out of it. I don't know how much of that was intentional versus he kind of butted heads, but I noticed that in the book.
Is there is there a bias maybe to in academia to like downweight administrators? I mean, he did have a lot of technical accomplishments, but if what he's most known for is being an administrator of these organizations, like maybe maybe there wasn't as much like limelight, I guess, like on his on his work afterwards.
I was surprised a little by the sort of conservatism about the problems of the 1960s and that he was writing about, because of course he wrote this right in that time period, or around 1970, I guess, but it's just eye-opening to me, sort of how conservative he was, right? And the way that he viewed the young people at the time. And maybe my image of him before was very idealistic, I think, because, I had heard of him when I was, spent my time at MIT. I remember this huge picture of him in one of the buildings at MIT. I think he was in front of a milling machine for some reason. But that's the image of him, and I'd heard all of these great things, and then I'm reading this book, and it's like, wow, he really didn't like what was going on, and I was surprised because I was a student of Jerry Letvin. I actually knew Lick for a short time before he died, which was just great. And I hadn't met really conservative folks at MIT before. And so it was kind of weird to kind of read that response. My image was just different. And maybe that's part of what happened, but I don't know if that preceded the era at the end of his life, whether that happened maybe a little bit before, I don't actually know.
For anyone who hasn't read the book or those parts, Gil, could you clarify what you mean by like conservative in terms of how he viewed young people and the world?
Well, so, he was very much a moral majority sort of person. He didn't use that exact phrase, but he used something really, really close. And he spoke about in quite bitter ways how, a few students, including those from the outside, were causing all the trouble on the campus and, all of this sort of thing. And I know that at that time, things were really rough at MIT, but the faculty that I had known were all the people on the left of that side. And it was just weird to read this book by somebody that clearly wasn't. I think Charles Draper was also a similar person, but that I knew well, but I didn't know that Bush was also in that kind of camp.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure if it hadn't, if that sort of political mindset caused any difficulty before. That is what I'm not sure of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He does have this this kind of I don't know how to describe it, like reverence, I guess, for what he calls the Boston men, right? Or like this kind of old history of Boston. Of I think there's some mention in there about like people sending clipper ships to China, like and he mentions, I think, several times like Brandeis and some like other figures, I think, from that from like earlier in his life in that era. Yeah, that's right, Ben, the Boston Brahmins. I was last night I was trying to remember whether or not there's any mention of a woman in a pivotal role like in these stories. I think the answer is no. I'm not sure. Yeah, but it's just a very yeah, like it does feel, reading it now, like a bit kind of anachronistic, Dominic?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things that kind of jumped out at me as I started to read the book was certainly how he was using the terms that, in a sense, innovation was about the organization of men, quite specifically. And I kind of did feel like, although obviously I'm reading it 50 years hence, but that even by then, perhaps a little bit of awareness that it was considerably not just men that are involved in innovation would have been quite helpful. And given how much time he actually spends writing about how people are conservative and reactionary and how that impedes progress, it can't help but make one wonder whether he also is missing something.
I didn't quite get the sense that he was opposed to the substance behind the protests, but that he was opposed more to the manner of the protests. He speaks of, riots for the sake of riots and these things.
Yeah.
And that was the impression that I got. It's easy to imagine that he was conservative, but to me, it doesn't come across from this particular writing. Yeah. And to the point about the, speaking of men, I think that's just, he may certainly have been referring to males, but that was also just how people wrote at that particular time. The male term was the generic.
Which reminds me of like the first chapter in general. Like, so in 60 years, he's reflecting on his life and career, and almost as much time has passed since he wrote this book. And I'm curious to hear from the group where you think he was prescient, where he was wrong, and how we might build on or update some of the things he talked about. And welcome, Jonathan. We're just responding to the book.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
Any other thoughts? If not, we can also move on to other themes or invite everyone to like share a passage that they'd want to discuss with the group.
Well, I'll answer you because this is front and center in the work that I do all of the time, right? And so I am always thinking about, just for the company that I work for, how to make it as innovative as possible. And I draw on lessons, from my own experience at MIT and at Bell Labs and at DARPA. But, they didn't come from thin air. They actually came from, like Ben talks about in the forward, the big reset here that happened as a result of World War II. And I think, these big events cause ripples. It sort of frightens me to think about, I wonder what the next big event is going to be that's going to cause the next set of ripples, because I kind of don't really want one, but it almost seems necessary that somehow this revolution in how innovation was funded and how innovation was done required the catastrophe of World War II to have the change occur. And I think that, in many ways, we're 80 years after, we're still living with the same thing, right? And so I'm not, truly free when I think about, how should we set up things, even a thing as simple as TRLs, technical readiness level, which go from basic research to applied research to product design. That whole mindset came out of World War II and then NASA after, et cetera, right? And I wonder, if I were truly free, if I was truly doing this from a blank sheet, what would I do? And as some of you may know, the idea of Pasteur's quadrant is a thing that DARPA adopted, which actually goes against the linear idea of TRLs from basic research to product design, where you say it's use inspired, but it's fundamental research, right? And so can you actually have a two-dimensional chart of thinking about how to do the kind of R&D that we do? And I worked very hard to try to replicate that from what I learned at DARPA, but it's just amazing to me to see how these modes of thought sort of evolved after World War II. It's like the slate was wiped clean, and it's like, okay, we now know what actually worked, but it's what worked in war. And this is now different, and yet we're still doing things that are very much thought constrained by what worked during World War II. And so I just wonder, from the group here, any thoughts about not only what Bush figured out in a positive sense, but are there things that we're missing because we're still thinking the way all of these folks did as a result of World War II?
Ben, I think in your forward you mentioned that there are some alternative models. Germany, I think, was one of your examples, and what does this look like outside of the U.S.? Can you elaborate on that?
The U.S. model is most places outside the U.S. Because of the nature of the reset. I mean, there's just some sort of hints of it in places like Germany, where you see the Max Planck Institutes. That are just they're organized differently than American universities, where you do have instead of PIs applying to the government for funding and doing grants that way, they the government gives basically continuously funds the entire institute, and then you have directors who then disperse that internally. And so that's just a different model, but there's really it's not wildly different.
Yeah, I can attest to that, because we work together with the Max Planck Institute, and they all have the same problems, and all mention the same things that they're concerned about.
And also just internationalization, like globalization has made it so that anywhere there's no pockets, right? It's very, very hard to isolate one system from everything else that's going on.
Any other thoughts on this topic? I mean, I thought it was interesting too, and this isn't and I think it's been widely observed that some of the things that worked very well in Bush's time, like patents and government funded research, might have contributed to like bloat. It's almost like we found all of the loopholes that can come up with systems like these. And now we have this system that is like very slow moving and prone to problems. And going back to Gil's question, like, do we think that a reset is necessary, or can we work within the system as it exists, and to what extent?
Yeah, I think there's some interesting talk now, like in the like the DSci community, and trying to find like essentially crowd fund science. You know, there's some talk about really focusing in on things like prizes and like retroactive you know, kinds of evaluations of impact. I don't know if any of this like really can like counter the might of right of the NSF and just this government funding model. There's a part of the book I thought was kind of striking. So this is on page 69, where he describes the he says the pattern of operation of OSRD, and he lists three different patterns like within OSRD. He says if a group was at work in a general area where either NDRC or CMR saw possibilities or recognized a need, that group, assuming competence, was called upon to go ahead with work under contract, right? So to me, that sounds like the NSF. The second thing is, sometimes, however, the swift advances necessary called for the creation of new major groupings of scientists and engineers. That sounds to me like this, people have been talking about this idea of focused research organizations. And then the third one is, the third form of operation in OSRD was especially true of the work of CMR. This was the central coordination of programs on a focal problem being carried forward in a large number of laboratories. And that to me sounds like DARPA. I don't know if there are like major like kinds of institutions like outside of this, but it is like it was just kind of striking to me how within OSRD he pioneered, you know, at least three of the major models here.
And Eric and Dan, you have your hands up. Did you want to chime in, Eric, first? I think you raised your hand first.
Yeah, I think it's a good mention to that what Wesley said. Like Wesley, you talked about how he structured the organization to produce innovation. But I think what's interesting, and that's a point to Gil, like why did he structure this? Because there was like an incentive to do so. Like the government needed something to happen fast. And it basically comes back to the question, do we need a crisis for big innovation to happen? And I experienced this myself. We were trying to build software for, I mean, this isn't deep into science, but we were trying to build software for poster sessions, online poster sessions, basically. And it didn't work because people they were afraid of trying it out. And then when COVID hit, all of a sudden, everything was not just, they didn't just want to try it, but everything was possible all of a sudden. Like all the concerns because of data security and, you know, all the usual limits to trying new stuff out were all of a sudden gone because there's this pandemic and we all just trying new stuff out, and it's totally okay if it doesn't work because everybody knows this is like a crisis. And this was interesting. So, and I'm not sure if there's a good answer to that. Like, do we need a crisis to make big leaps? And then when we have a crisis, people like Vannevar Bush maybe have the power to actually do something. And then the form that they build is only secondary. Primary is the psychological issue of having this urgent goal.
Dan, you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, well, just to respond to what Eric said, I think there was some negative aspects to what happened in science during COVID, because a lot of stuff that got funded, a lot of stuff that should not have got funded because it was for COVID. Like the barriers, sort of criteria like dropped a lot. And there's actually a paper by John Ioannidis about like what he calls the COVIDization of research, which I can put in the chat. But what I was going to say was Alaka mentioned was questioning whether we need some kind of like reset, and yeah, I would like to hear more people like just throwing out more drastic policy ideas. They're probably less likely to get implemented, but by kind of shifting the Overton window to like when you put out like drastic ideas, you can kind of shift the discussion a bit. So for instance, one thing we could do is just ban certain types of studies completely, like small underpowered studies are a huge issue that have been polluting the commons and creating this horrible like replication crisis. And like I think it'd be good if we just, one thing we can consider is just having a blanket ban on certain types of studies. What would happen was a lot of researchers would not get funding, and like initially there would be a lot of like pain, but then I think eventually universities may restructure their the way they're doing research, so that they have they're pooling resources so they could do larger studies.
So do you primarily mean like sample size issues or cases where you can't like do any controls?
A variety of things. Right now in what I've seen in like biomedical sciences is it's all like a lot of the funding is going to individual labs that just have limited resources. So they're just very limited in what they can do. So the quality of the research is very low. And like, we saw this in like fMRI studies, like for years and years and years, the studies weren't replicating, and because they weren't using large enough sample sizes. And also like a lot of PIs just lack statistical expertise. But like by pooling multiple labs together and like also bringing in statisticians, you could solve a lot of that probably.
Dominic, did you want to respond, or did you have another thought?
So I had a kind of thought about the question of a reset and a crisis, and whether kind of both on like whether we need one, but also on whether one may actually be happening. Because I kind of feel that we are living through a reset age, but that it's not going to take the form of a kind of big bang crisis, but rather that we are, that with the rise of the globalization-based internet technology and what that enables, I think over time is going to change the viability of the model of the nation state. And that is not something that's going to happen straight away. That is a kind of slow burn reset that many could probably also call a crisis, some will call an opportunity. And I don't necessarily think that as a society we have really done any thinking about what we would actually do and how we would run society if nation states were not viable. And a lot of the structures through which things are done are kind of based on the assumption that they will always be there, possibly one that is going to be increasingly dangerous. And I feel that we are seeing that, like there seems to be, governments have less and less money, but there seems to be more and more they should be doing with that money. At some point, something is going to break.
Andre?
Well, the previous point is kind of hard to for me to say much about. I don't have a stance on the future of the government. I did read The Network State by Balaji, and I thought it was quite nonsensical. But anyway, I guess a point I wanted to make was that I think a lot of the issues, like we're kind of grasping at institutional structures that are impeding some sort of break, but it seems like the problems are more cultural than institutional, maybe. And I know that's a weird thing for an economist to say, but it seems like in time during the World War, for example, just the sense of urgency that people had for doing research and doing important stuff. And maybe even what was important was way more obvious at the time. Whereas now, everyone's kind of just fucking around. I mean, how, like, I don't know, like, you know, I'm pretty close to the upper echelons of my research field, at least. And yeah, there are people that work hard, but I mean, like, a lot of it feels like a game that people are playing. Who can get the most citations? You know, how does one put the thing in the literature? And it's not about the big important ideas. It's more about what is the minimum viable publishable unit that gets citations. And I don't really know how to change that culture. And maybe there is an institutional way to nudge it along in the right direction. But it does seem to me that people are just working not that hard on the wrong stuff for the wrong reasons. So, yeah.
So Jorge and Dan, I think you have some responses. So chime in, and then in a bit, we'll probably switch to another theme because there's like a lot of things that are interesting to the group.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on that about economics. I also studied a bit of that. And one thing I noticed is that, yes, you have lots of theories to explain things. And even in monetary theory, you have different angles, like credit to theory of money, commodity theory of money, whatever. But at the end of the day, when the war arrives, there's only one explanation. You can explain everything in terms of war finance, justify taxes, and all the institutions that you build to issue money. And it seems that what you were saying about the problem of government being behind research in different ways is also a problem of funding. So war finance is about funding the war, and like scientific research has had very good moments in history that are very closely related to the way that you're funding war. So it's a bit of a pessimistic take on it, but I've had a hard time trying to find a counter argument. If you have it, please go ahead. And the other side is this book I mentioned at the beginning, Scientific Freedom, criticizing the process of peer review, right? It's probably related to funding. It's probably related to how we are incentivizing in terms of, oh yeah, the number of citations and whatnot. And this other striped book called The Revolt of the Public also touches on the scientific community, how it has built credibility and authority over time, and how they're losing that authority recently because of the way that this studies are being made, and how you get funding and all that. So yeah, it's just loosely connected maybe, but yeah, that's my take on it.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I love Andre's point about culture. And I hadn't read the book yet, but I think it's probably a fascinating thing is trying to understand the culture back then, because they probably had seen how scientific research really helped in the war effort, and then they were thinking about the coming confrontation with the USSR, and that obviously that was a huge motivator, and kind of how we got to like that whole Cold War era was how we got to be the preeminent country for scientific research. I guess like one kind of like bright light I see is like the longevity community, because they're really motivated to cure aging, right? And they're not just like trying to become a professor or get papers published or whatever. They really want to they're really driven by like reducing suffering, or some of them may be just selfish and want to live longer, but whatever it is, like they're motivated to actually solve things. So I see like they seem to be very open to like new ways of structuring their research, just because they're so focused on like getting things done rather than just publishing.
I think I maybe have a couple useful tidbits on what Andre said and what Jorge said. So for Andre, in terms of playing the game and kind of thinking about alternatives, I was thinking about this the other day, because obviously it's hard, like you have to count something, citation feels reasonable, and we see kind of how bad it goes. But what's interesting is the system way back, probably 80, 90 years ago, did work differently. And the way it worked was, it doesn't feel right, because there was a lot of personal freedom in department heads and other big professors just getting to say, oh, this is a good guy, like we're gonna hire him. Like famous accounts being like, people know Oppenheimer's letter about Feynman at the Manhattan Project, where there was just this PhD student from Cornell, and Oppenheimer wrote a letter to the head of the Berkeley physics department and just said, Bethe said he would rather lose any two people on his team before he lost this guy. And these things kind of abound from that era. Like Francis Crick, when he was at the Cavendish, was a 35-year-old PhD student, and they were really annoyed at him because he had not finished his PhD. He had no positive results, and they were annoyed because there was an internal sense of, oh, he's a first-rate man, is kind of the verbiage they would use. But he needed to have a positive result to show for it, and then they could get him a professorship just because they needed something to back up their positive words for that. And then kind of last data point on this would be, like John Nash was helped out for years and years and years, even after he kind of started to degrade mentally. Like John Nash has an H-index of 8 for reference. Like I'm sure that'll sound appalling to somebody today, where you need like an H-index of 60 or something like that. And within the math world, like people would help him out too. They'd send funds because they were like, anything we can do to help this guy. And somewhere between kind of his era and like nowadays, there's a Atlantic piece that comes out every year on Pi Day of these two great Ukrainian mathematicians who just could not get a job because they were hard to work with. And so like the system has changed between now and then. And I get where you want to bureaucratize it, but academia is still not that diverse. It's still kind of a boys' club. So I'm not sure we've gotten that much for the bureaucratization. And then quick point, George, so like what is the pre-World War II model? So people are annoyed at the military's presence and like a lot of academic funding and stuff because they have deep pockets, but also people will villainize corporate financing and things like that. But that kind of used to be the alternative pre-World War II, where the government was maybe only like 6-7% of the money kind of flooding into university research, but people like state actors and corporate money were closer to 40%. And what that money craved was a pretty practical output. And you'll see that with a lot of the oil producing states, like Texas A&M is not Harvard, but it's the Harvard of petroleum engineering. University of Illinois is a really top agricultural school. And then places like MIT kind of lived on corporate money. And those are the people who have the deep pockets. And that was the alternative kind of pre-military. Like MIT used to self-fund some departments, like their applied physics department, just through corporate funding and helping them out. So that was just a little data point.
Thank you. I think who else has their hands up? Gil, you've had your hand up for a bit.
Oh, Gil, you're muted.
Sorry. It is wonderful to hear some of these thoughts. And I think that, I'm not sure I would have said it quite that people are just fucking around, but I think the focus on citations and all of this sort of stuff, Ben wrote a wonderful guide to how DARPA works on the inside. One of the things that I can add to that, there is absolutely a negative view of citations and that whole measure and metric of things. In fact, if anything, a proposal that talks about the publication records of the PIs is thought of negatively. We care about ideas, we don't care about rankings or anything like that. And I think that part of the problem is that a lot of professors, especially junior professors, don't really know what goes on inside the funding agencies themselves. Now, I've heard other stories about, what NSF is like, what the NIH is like, and so forth. So it may be different there. But I think if people really knew how DARPA worked on the inside a little bit better, maybe it could help to resolve some of this thing. The other thing that I'll say, and again, I'm lucky enough to be a bit older, I think, than most of you here. So I knew some of the people who worked in the rad lab at MIT during World War II. And what they told me is that the reason the productivity was so high is that it was because our sons were dying, okay? And I think that as we talked about, what kind of crisis does it make to create the Great Reset or to at least fix some of these bureaucratic things, which always tend to kind of grow. I think that climate change may be one, and I'm surprised that the weather is being so bad that even though climate change has a huge lag in it between what we do now and what the effect is going to be, it seems that nature is kind of gracing us with less time delay than we had worried was going to be there. And people are getting really worried now, which is kind of good. And maybe that kind of crisis, short of war, can help to spur on better R&D. At least what I'm seeing on R&D for climate is that it's actually quite good, and people really, really care. And I think it may be quite similar in many ways to what wartime R&D was like. So maybe that's an example of, a smaller reset that can kind of help here.
Dominic, why don't you, I wanted to give your comment, and then I'd like to switch directions a bit and talk about creativity and innovation.
Yeah, so I was just kind of thinking, and it's when someone mentioned revolt of the public and a few other points that people were making, kind of brought to my mind about the kind of crisis in confidence of the public in the scientific community that we have seen growing in recent years. And it was kind of making me think that a lot of the scientific stuff that I read about, you can kind of see how there's a sort of incremental progress is written about as the main point that is definitely of interest if you're interested in science. But what it maybe does often also fail to do is to present a kind of vision that the public who may not be interested in science can buy into, a vision of something that's actually going to happen that has practical purpose in their lives that they can understand easily from the material that is being put out. And I feel that maybe that could be important, and the way that things are presented needs to be more mindful of actually continuing to have public confidence that science is relevant to them.
Yeah, like maybe in the absence of a crisis, like there needs to be a moonshot, and like literally, like in the case of the U.S. like going to the moon. Bush was, I think, initially like not particularly interested in that effort, but in the end, sort of turned around it. But yeah, so that's that's maybe a good segue. Actually, I wanted to talk a bit about creativity and innovation, and like one of the fun things about this book is like it's the structure of it is it's very personal. It's a lot of these just stories about what happened in the war, and then like shoved in there like every so often I think it's just some kind of an amazing insight. So so he talks a bit on page 175. He says he proposes a kind of a model of like how how innovation can work in an industry. He says in an industry that has been that has become closely standardized, where nearly all competing companies are comfortably making profits, minor improvements can readily be introduced, but major improvements are up against a stone wall. The prosperous company sees no need to change. The borderline company cannot afford the cost. I thought that was extraordinary. It's like a version of the innovator's dilemma here, right? Where there are these entrenched interests that kind of keep an organization on a path of incremental change, but that doing something like large that like breaks the status quo is very difficult to push through. But I just wanted to see if people have any commentary on that. Ben?
Well, I think in addition to the cultural pieces, there's this whole like field that we don't even talk about that much anymore of systems research, where like we don't have things that where it's basically the idea of like, okay, you have a system, and it's like if you want to do like a drop-in replacement, like that's fine, right? You can change like one component, but the thing that you need to do to really like create really new systems is then like make a big change to one piece and then propagate that through the entire system. And the work to do that propagation is actually like kind of like expensive and time consuming, and you can't publish about it, right? Because you're not actually doing anything new. You're just like saying like, okay, I'm going to make the rest of the system work around this other change. And so we like don't, and so like from a corporate standpoint, it's not very efficient, and so there's not a lot of support from it in like for-profit organizations. And then in academia, you want to do that like one change and then say like, oh, and like someone else will like propagate this. And so the work to actually do that systems research never gets done. And so I think like that's a big part of like that phenomena.
Jorge?
Yeah, on the comment on the innovator's dilemma, I actually had that insight as well. And it seems that, I mean, regardless of what happens to academia and the citations and whatnot, there's this like age of the blog and all that we're publishing more and more valuable content on the web, but that has not like shaken the way that academic articles are published yet. Also in the Revolt of the Public, there's this mention about some scientific community, probably climate, but I'm not sure, dismissing someone that only published stuff on the web. And one of the academics, part of the establishment, recognizes like, yeah, we never pay attention to him because he only publishes blog posts, right? So we're really going to like apply the insights of disruptive innovation, maybe not to mobilize, but at least to analyze what's happening or going to happen, is not defining what's going to happen with citations necessarily, but pay more attention to what valuable content should be published openly and not behind paywalls. I was talking to a researcher from Spain a couple of days ago precisely about this problem. And first she mentioned Google Scholar is really bad for finding relevant research for her to cite. And also like for them to publish and then be hidden behind a paywall is hurtful, because there's less people willing to pay for their articles or the subscriptions to read the research in the first place before they even decide to cite it. So I don't know if the disruptive innovation framework is useful to say, oh yeah, let's create something like academia.com, I think she mentioned, so that we can at least publish openly and then try to reset this whole bureaucracy of trying to climb the ladder and get more like peer review and citations. But regardless of the content, that's something to pay attention to. The web started actually as an insight on, oh yeah, maybe the things that have more citations are more valuable. And then you get the Google people doing the backup stuff and ranking pages by the number of citations or backlinks, right? So there's definitely something there, but I don't know what to say about the content. And it depends a lot on what you're publishing and how serious it is and whatnot. But climate is one of those examples in that book.
Do we have any computer scientists or electrical engineers here? It's always been my sense that those fields care a little less about this, just because I talked to some electrical engineers who would say that they would make hires based on conference proceedings and stuff like that, just because things were moving very quickly. And like for somebody who reads more economics literature, that's unheard of. They haven't even changed the structure of papers in economics back from when they pretended that they still put structural models at the beginning. And you talk to these top professors who might win Nobels, and they're like, yeah, it's the last step I do. I like find my results and then I just find a model that works and I stick it in. So for like the electrical engineering CS folks, like does citations seem to weigh less heavy when you use conference proceedings, or are people still using some kind of proxy?
And Ben has a question here too about whether it has anything to do with the age of a discipline. So any responses to Eric or Ben?
I would, oh, sorry that I didn't raise my hand the virtual way. Is it okay if I go?
Yes, it's okay, go.
Sorry. Certainly, you know, when I was on the faculty of EECS at MIT, of course 6, we were perfectly happy to look at conference proceedings. What actually mattered the most were whether the person had ideas that weren't obvious and were really kind of shockingly good. That is what mattered. The number of citations didn't matter. The particular journals, you know, things like that didn't matter anywhere near as much as when you listen to the idea when they gave their job talk. Were you blown away by a unintuitive idea that was really something? And I don't know how to describe it. It's not a number, but you know it when you see it, right? That's that famous phrase. And I think that for hiring at elite institutions, probably that happens a lot. I think the difficulty is that most institutions aren't in the top ranks. And so they then fall back to various metrics to sort of take the place of saying, wow, this person's great, let's just hire them. But I saw lots of that at MIT, at least during the times when I was there.
Yeah, I just want to say I have a very low opinion of conference proceedings, except for like in machine learning, they have some very, very high quality ones. But when I switched from physics to machine learning research, and in physics, we rarely ever publish in conference proceedings, and they're really looked down upon as just, you know, very low quality work. It's been kind of off-putting actually in machine learning, seeing how many people are publishing in these low-tier conferences, just really, really poor quality work. And yeah, so I don't think like publishing, I mean, in theory, someone could, you know, publish something. It just in general, like, I don't think like allowing people to publish more freely is the right way. I think we need we need to incentivize people to publish higher quality work. And the way to do that is like, you know, I think like making it more difficult actually to publish and have your work respected. It's a double-edged sword, but I wanted to make that point.
Any responses to that? And I think someone has their hand up. Dominic?
I
Dominic.
think Ross had his hand up first, but
Parth, why don't you go ahead?
Oh yeah, you know, one idea that I've heard is the idea of creating multiple tenure tracks, where, you know, some are based on things like, you know, knowledge synthesis or knowledge application, or, you know, doing something important, even if it doesn't lead to a lot of, you know, publishable research. I wonder what folks think about this idea.
I think there's a shockingly strong argument for this. So I wouldn't have figured it, but kind of I write in the same sort of area of space as Matt Clancy does. And I know some professors follow me because like no professor is really incentivized to write about what I write about. But I've learned that all the PhD students in this space read, and professors read Matt Clancy's stuff. And essentially he's just synthesizing it all and telling it to like a random smart person who's not in the field. But the fact that all of the professors seem to be reading his stuff means that there's a desperate need, even for the makers of this research, to have somebody who's better at synthesizing this stuff, synthesizing it and helping them. And I'd imagine that exists across academic space.
Dominic and Andre, you have your hands up.
yes, I was kind of wanting to answer to Dan's point about the idea that it should actually be harder to publish stuff, because I feel that if you put up, in theoretically, you can imagine a kind of utopia where you have a nice unbiased group of people who vet things and allow to be published stuff that's good. But in actual fact, what tends to happen, I feel, is that any group of people tend to both have bias and also try to gatekeep to keep out people whose ideas may actually challenge the status quo. And in order to have the best free flow of ideas and make sure that important ideas are not missed just because they may be thought of by someone who doesn't have a kind of conventional sense of recognition, we actually need to make it easier for more and more ideas to get published and taken seriously. But then also to add to that, well, there needs to be some kind of system to ensure that people who do actually know what they're doing vet ideas that are actually going to be used in ways that have major impacts in a practical sense. And quite how you balance those two things, I am not sure.
Any responses? And Andre, I know you've had your hand up.
Yeah, so I kind of agree that as much stuff as possible should be publishable, but then there should be a better system for verifying quality. So I think that's the fundamental trade-off, and it's actually a trade-off that you have in a lot of actually online platforms. So like anyone can, write a post or create a shop on Etsy or something like that. And the goal of the forum is to sort through all that and kind of recommend what is good, or at least appropriately display the quality to the other side of the market. And I think it's interesting that we don't really have a good system like that for research, although there are some attempts to do that. For example, there's a platform, I think it's called Cite, that tries to figure out whether certain papers have negative citations about them. So I wanted to mention that. And then I guess like in response to the discussion about multiple kind of tenure tracks and also like the judgment of hiring committees, I'm wondering like to what extent the solutions have to be tailored field by field. Like perhaps it is the case in computer science that the top people are just having these brilliant ideas, and people with taste can grok it and they respect that. But I think in other fields, perhaps fields that require very large collaborations, or also alternatively fields that are more social sciencey and less theoretically oriented, it'll be less clear what those great ideas are, or at least it'll be harder to attribute credit to them. So I guess I wanted, to open up the question of like, how different should the solution be for every field? And also, so if we could change how different fields are organized, is that expected to be a top-down effort, or more realistically, the field would have to change itself, because in some sense, the field is the one that is choosing the hiring decisions and so on and so forth. And so it's hard for a university, for example, to get rid of a department. That very rarely happens. So the department is self-propagating. So how do you change that? So that was a lot, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on the distinction that you guys made on publishing versus assessing quality, because in academic publishing, probably the main problem is that it's convoluted. It's just the same thing, right? And there are probably historical reasons for that, but right now you could easily think of separating the process of having public access to a document, which I guess is the root of publishing, just to make it public, right? And the completely different thing of assessing the quality. There's some similar conversation happening in education in general. Like one thing is the accreditation process of you going through a degree and getting the actual degree as a signal to the market that you went through this process and they're good. You have some quality in some dimension. And the process of learning itself that some companies or initiatives want to separate, whether that's feasible or not, that's a separate question. But it's a parallel in the sense that you can separate the process of issuing the certificate and the process of publishing the content itself. Probably each field is going to have to come up with its own way of assessing quality, because you cannot talk about quality in painting or whatever in the same sense that you talk about quality in code. But also software interviews are an example of this screening process that is broken, because I mean, lots of people are getting jobs in programming without having a programming degree. So the industry clearly already noticed that that's not the only signal of programming quality. And also publishing in a repository is not the same as creating an open source project. You can just write some code and put it openly out there on GitHub. That does not mean that you are publishing anything at any level of quality. You're just making a statement that, hey, you would like other people to read this thing. And then I guess it would have to be bottoms up, like other people finding the thing and then using whatever signals like stars or whatever to say, hey, this is interesting, check it out. And eventually some measure of quality could emerge. But you have to start by separating those two, make it public and then measure how good it is.
Yeah, you know, people in the scientific community like to complain about how broken the journal system is of, you know, gatekeeping publishing. I don't know if I've really heard a reasonable alternative though, right? Like if you have like no sorts of nothing that like kind of restricts the flow of information to like an amount that people can actually kind of evaluate and understand things. Like, would we be in a better place? You know, like maybe another way of asking the question actually is like, if you just banned all journals, like would the kind of progress that we're making in science right now be like the exact same? Would it be equivalent? Would it be better? Would it be worse? And why?
Ben, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, just really quickly. I think that even in like old fields, so my partner is a professional chemist, and she's like, yeah, I basically read things only on archive now, and so like you can see what's going on, and so journals are used as the thing that sort of like you use on your resume, but like people in disciplines know what's good, right? Like they talk to each other, they know who's good. And so I think the journals as and I guess it's a question of like internal to a discipline versus external to it. And so I don't really know about like how people like, I think we have a separate discussion about how people outside of a discipline know what's good. But within it, inside of a discipline, I think you could get rid of journals and nobody would notice.
Yeah, and kind of what I just want to say, what I kind of was getting at was like like for people like Ben was saying who are outside of a discipline or a niche area, like to evaluate quality of research or whether they even want to read a paper. Like I think it's useful to have journals as sort of a signal of like some level of quality at least. That's kind of what I was getting at when I was saying it's a double-edged sword. And the only thing I worry about, it is possible right now to just publish stuff on archive, and there are huge benefits to that, like not having to go through peer review. But yeah, it's just it's kind of like you need to have standards at some point also, or things. I do see like standards appearing to devolve in a lot of areas, but that's just my impression.
Areas like what? Just curious.
Like biomedical research, AI. Yeah, like with people just publishing on archive and yeah, just like just that's sort of my impression. But
we've got a couple of people with hands up. Gil, I think you might have raised your hand first. Did you want to chime in?
Yeah, sure. So, so just to note, we're getting a little bit far afield of the book, but I think this is a neat rat hole to go down. The real difficulty, and again, I've been in different positions seeing this from different points of view. So let me just give you the most recent one. I think that the peer review process has lots and lots of flaws in it that work both ways. There's a lot of stuff that shouldn't make it through that does. And on the other hand, without it, there's also a lot of really poor quality stuff, as has been pointed out, that ends up in conferences, and it's worse than incremental. It's often duplicative and it's often wrong. And so there's a huge amount of noise, and it's very hard to kind of pick out the signal. So I think it would be great for the young people of today, meaning all of you, to figure out a better way to do it. But I think the system is fairly broken, and I would very much like to see that. I think the paywall system is just awful. And to be quite honest, because the return on investment of subscribing to lots of different journals is so low, companies like ours just don't bother to do it. And so typically what we'll do is we will figure out, who's good in some other way. And then once we, of course, start talking to the person, we ask them to send us the stuff that they've written, no matter where it showed up, right? And then we just look at it ourselves. So I think what's really going on is that there's a parallel system to evaluate the strength of work and the strength of the people that are doing the work, and that the journals are sort of this side system that's doing kind of an archive to keep things for a long time. But there's so many things that are wrong with it, and mostly the paywalls just sort of piss us off, and then we don't bother to do the next thing. The IEEE is kind of an exception.
Elsevier's margin, I found an earnings report from Elsevier, because I expected their margins to be massive. They're claiming margins of like 8 or 10%, which I found crazy. Like I didn't understand how that could be. But sorry, the reason I raised my hand was to Ben's point in terms of talking about letting people in the field kind of recognize quality for themselves. And a very extreme case of this was, it was very common in like the 30s, 40s, 50s for them not just to cite papers in their like Nature articles or whatever. They would just cite a letter from one person to another, because a lot of times you would just say, oh, I sent a letter to this person, I'll forward it to you, and they would just say, oh, Feynman wrote this to Fermi, and they would put it in there. And the understanding wasn't, they knew it wasn't a paper, but they would just say, you're all physicists here reading this, like judge this for yourself, this is how I'm using it. Which is, I don't know if that's good or bad, I'm not a scientist, but I thought it was a cool extreme case of them saying, like, we're all adults here, like judge quality for yourselves.
Yeah, after that, I don't have much to say, because that was like pretty much in the lines of what I wanted to comment on. But yeah, just to mention on what Wesley said, there's no need to get rid of the journals, I think, in the same way that there's no need to get rid of the universities. If they're doing any job in the assessing quality, they can continue to do it. The only thing I would say is that I keep going back to this book. I promise this is the last time I mentioned the Revolt of the Public. It was self-published initially, and then it got noticed, I guess, by Stripe Press or someone else, and someone assessed the quality and said, let's reprint it, right? So my point is, there seems to be stigma in not publishing inside a journal, like automatically stigmatized as not being good enough quality, otherwise you would make it into a journal. And there's also stigma in self-publishing a book. So, I mean, we have all the technology, all the marketplaces. I think you can self-publish on Amazon really easily and even charge for it. But there's still this perception that, oh, if there's no editor or there's no journal behind you, maybe you're not good enough. In computer science, it seems that we're moving forward with that. And we don't even ask about degrees. Like, it's not a bad signal if you didn't graduate from a computer science degree. Of course, it adds something, but there are lots of programmers that didn't even go to school, right? So, I mean, there's some precedent, but this word stigma is definitely around, and maybe there's something we can do about it. What Ben described is, Gil, sorry, sounds amazing, because people who know about the domain, making their own decisions about how to assess that, and then talking to each other with all these technologies, it seems to be the right way to go.
So we've got about 40 minutes or so left. We'll switch over to like the theme of leadership for a bit and organizations, and Wes will kick that off. And then after that, we'd like to invite everyone to share any passages or examples or technologies from the book that they wanted to discuss with the group. But right before we switch, did anyone have any closing thoughts on the topics that we've just discussed?
I was just thinking that it was interesting, some of the things that Kirky was saying, and that what kind of makes me think about how, like in the tech industry, there is a greater tendency maybe than in many other places to think not about actually actively like closing down or banning the things that we think should not exist, but rather to actively create what we would see as their replacements, essentially give those to the world, and if they do turn out to be better, they should naturally replace the things that we want them to replace, and then those other things can become obsolete and kind of die of their own accord rather than having to actually be formally shut down or banned. I don't know if it always works, but it feels to me like a kind of less disruptive model, though it's often called disruption.
Yeah, quickly on that, I forgot to mention, to go back to the book, or at least to Vannevar Bush, right? Wesley mentioned if we don't have journals, maybe there's going to be a flood of information and we cannot make sense of it, which is part of what Bush was worried about when he wrote the article, as we may think. Like, we cannot make sense of all the amount of information and we cannot get to the record, and it's so difficult to find stuff. And it seems that he's talking about Google, right? In a way, like, oh, we have so many web pages, but how do you get to them without a classification system? So yeah, I don't think the problem is limited in information, because we have like tons of amounts more than what he noticed at the time, and it's going to be worse in 10 and 20 years. But definitely about designing ways of assessing and finding the things that we deem valuable. The thing of trails that he described in the article was, for me, basically a way of saying, okay, maybe I spent 1 or 2 years finding something valuable, and this trail that I leave in the process, sometimes I like forget, ask an expert to teach a beginner, and they don't remember how they learned, right? So this process of recording, oh, how did I get to this insight? How did I find this valuable paper? Should be recorded in such a way that I can share with someone else. And maybe those trails would be the signal of quality that should emerge as something valuable. In nature, you have ants with pheromone trails. And if a trail is valuable, other trails, other ants will follow it. And that chemical, physical process of keeping the trail alive is a strong signal that there's food on the other side. And something similar can happen with valuable research, as long as we can simulate those ant trails, you know, but that's a different topic.
Great. So I'd like to change the topic here to leadership, and I think the way that the book closes out actually is quite nice. So I wanted to bring up the point that Bush brings up at the end. He talks a bit about the dysfunction in our political system. Right. He says, you know, our methods of electing your president is crude in the extreme. Pre-convention juggling with local political bigwigs is obscure. In it, and the travel and speech making costs millions, the sources of which are sometimes questionable, and so on and so forth. And then he says, yet out of it have appeared great presidents, ranging from men such as Hoover and Eisenhower, of no originally apparent political skill, to JFK, as skilled a man politically as his country's produced. He says, there must be something more beyond the absurd machinery, some subtle way in which the public will become exerted, some force beyond political manipulation, unrecognized yet powerful. I believe there is, and that I've seen it work. We may yet be crude, but we have come far. What do people think about this? Like, is he just like waxing nostalgic here, or is there actually something about no matter how messed up our political system seems, like actually we do produce some great leaders?
And how has that held up over time? Gil?
Well, so again, I think that the advantage of being older is that things were worse before. And I think that he's essentially saying the same thing, that as bad as things are, he's an optimist. And actually, he ends the book the same way he begins, right? By sort of talking about a deep optimism, despite the fact that things are so messed up, and warning people not to despair. And, you know, I don't want to presume the political leanings of any of the folks here, though statistically, I'm pretty sure that you're all on one side. But, you know, things have been worse. And I think that from all of that, what I get out of it is that we're woefully behind on scientific advancements in behavioral science. And we're woefully behind on educating our young people about human nature so that they become more functional citizens versus people that end up, you know, flocking into mobs the way that people tend to now. And I just think that in many ways we sort of focus most of our time teaching young people the wrong thing, rather than talking to them about, you know, how people work and how societies work, and to watch out for, and how to tell a con man from an honest person, et cetera, even though they sometimes can feel the same. And there's way too little research being done on all of this stuff. So it was a question that I actually asked the DARPA director when I first got there, and went and visited, you know, all the PMs that I could and saw what they worked on. And I said, you know, look, you're working on a lot of gadgets for defense, but war is about people. And where's the research on people? And DARPA actually went through some really tough times being sort of scolded for doing stuff that seemed spooky, because it had to do with human psychology and so forth. But I think the result has been actually an incredible lack of insight and understanding and good models about how human beings and how human societies work. And so we have now basically a behavior science that's full of opinions and just that. And we really haven't made much progress there versus what we could. So that's what I got out of both the beginning and the end of the book. A tremendous optimism in the potential for progress, but also a lot of talk about how things are messed up. And I don't think that has changed.
Yeah, I really enjoyed his passages on the need for optimism, the need for teachers who give students like a well-rounded education, not only in terms of like the I guess like the theoretical skills, but he shows like the importance of why we need to educate people on having a tactile understanding of the subjects that they pursue, and also how to work well with other people. And one thing that I kept feeling was like, I wish we could talk more about, like he would go into more detail. He already does from his prior experience, but I don't know that it's necessarily clear from the world today, like how to do this the right way. And to Gil's points about the lack of research and like continued understanding of it, I think we're all the poorer for it. So curious what others think on those themes, and if anyone thinks that there is like a decline in optimism and the possibility of success, or if we're doing well on that front.
Do we have any optimism?
Well, I raised the question of like, how does one even know if there's a decline in optimism, right? Because it's like there's always like I don't. I mean, this is my bias, is that like I don't trust like that kind of poll, and like then if you don't have like good statistics on it, then like you can point to anecdotes of like people being extremely optimistic throughout history, and you can point to anecdotes of people being extremely pessimistic throughout history. And so I don't even know how we would know. And maybe that, like, I don't know, I might actually assert that that's the wrong question to ask. And just like, it's like, it doesn't matter whether other people are optimistic. It's like, just like, you should be optimistic. And forge forward.
I know in the political realm, right? Pew for many decades has run polls on like what people think about political life and just generally American life. I don't know of any really like long-standing polls about what people think of scientific progress. So I don't know how you would like measure that exactly, but we do have measures of like public perception of polarization, for instance.
Eric?
Yeah, just a quick point on how would you measure optimism and pessimism. You could just look at movies at the time about the future and see whether they present a good or bad future. And I'm not sure if people have done this, but I've heard that people have done this, and it seems that movies back then in the 50s, 60s, 70s had more optimism about future scenarios. Now, this is a little dumb. This is not as good as a poll. But your second question about how does it matter? I think it matters a great deal whether people are generally optimistic or pessimistic, because it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more forward-looking you are, and the more energetic you are going to, go into the future, actually look for solutions. If you're pessimistic, you might not look hard enough, or not with enough energy. Like, I realize these are some very weak and touchy points, but yeah.
If I could be slightly combative, if that's true, if it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, why didn't the 50s lead to what the 50s predicted?
You mean flying cars?
Yeah, like exactly. Like if it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, then shouldn't optimism lead to amazing things?
I mean, yeah, okay, let me respond. I mean, isn't this exactly what we're trying to figure out here? Like, don't we have a feeling that progress is slowing down? And 50s, 60s, especially the 70s, like some huge inventions have been made in the 70s. Václav Smil has this entire list of things that have been invented just in the 70s. And I can't reproduce it, but it seemed like a lot. And right now, people seem to think progress is slowing down. So, I don't know.
Is it optimism or something else? And that's an open question to the group. I mean, I'm biased / sympathetic to a sentiment that like young people, even if there's like a reach goal or a project, like there needs to be some feeling that it is possible to pursue this, or that it's worthwhile to pursue this. And that's where good teachers come in. And again, this is just like my unscientific bias. And I do think that's important, and that like to tell young people that something is impossible, or that, oh, things won't get better, is dangerous. I've been out of school for a long time, so I don't know what it's like now. But those are just like my thoughts. And Ben says it's a cesspit, I believe, in response to schools.
Yeah, so
yeah.
Can I, yeah, just on that topic, one thing I thought a little bit, I thought was curious is that there are these pockets of optimism in engineering and science that have worked out. And I think perhaps one of the prime examples of that is SpaceX. And I'm wondering, like, if anyone has any theories about how it was able to be so successful against seemingly all odds, and no one actually thought that it would achieve its goals, and yet it has exceeded them wildly. And so what preconditions made for that? And can we learn something from that in other fields?
We have someone from SpaceX, so we can call him Jeremy.
Jeremy.
Yeah, I guess I should just jump in without raising my hand here, because I have unique perspective. Yeah, we spoke for a better part of an hour about research, and not an awful lot about development. SpaceX has done relatively little original research, and the bulk of what we've done is strictly development. A lot of the technologies that made the Falcon rocket possible have been around for decades. And so it took sort of like simple willpower and sweat to break the status quo and disrupt the industry. And that oftentimes, comes from, just one person or a group of small people. And I see Gil's raising his hand. Go ahead.
So if I can add to that, so that is all true. There was a complementary effort on the government side, which was also new, which I don't think Bush talks about, but I think that from my discussions with Tom Khalil, who was at OSTP during the time when SpaceX was sort of, launching, the innovation was that the government lowered the what was it called? Not the execution risk, but the financial risk, basically, by ensuring that SpaceX would have a customer who would be willing to pay and willing to make them profitable if they pulled off the execution. And by doing so, now I'm remembering, they got rid of the market risk. So when SpaceX began, there was a partnership that happened between the Office of Science, Technology Policy and the White House and Musk, where basically the folks at OSTP, and I think Tom was sort of the leader of this, said, okay, what we'll do, even though NASA kind of doesn't like it, is we'll get rid of your market risk. If you can build it, we will come. And it turns out that for venture capitalists that are looking to fund things, they worry about both market risk and execution risk. And of course, SpaceX still had to do everything that Jeremy just said, which was to actually do it and to make it all work and to be bold and, have courage, even though things were hard and lots of stuff blew up, et cetera, et cetera. But at least the market risk was gotten rid of. And it's actually a very interesting thing because in a lot of ways, war does the same thing. If the scientists can pull it off and make weapons that are better, war will use them. And pre-commitment, Wes, it's something like that. And I think it would be really neat to study what OSTP did to make that happen and to wonder if maybe that's also part of what can make this thing work here too. But I think it's very much taking the advantages that helped a lot of technical advances happen during wartime and make them happen during peacetime for something different by saying, if you make it, we will pay for it.
James, I think you've had your hand up and so has Jeremy. So James, go first.
Yeah, something I was just thinking as we're talking about SpaceX is like, I don't know, a new pocket of innovation that really stood out to me was like, everything we've really been talking about is like research and like government funded stuff. And I think but the book and the discussion have neglected a little bit like what I see most of the startup ecosystem today being, which is someone starts something basically for free, like thanks to cloud computing and like access to just, computing in general. And then they prove some worth and then the funding comes on later. And that just seems like a missing part from all of the discussion. That's, I know something like Google has like an academic background to it, but you can imagine, the biggest companies of today are just being started with something which didn't exist at all in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and prior decades.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy, did you want to respond?
Yeah, so I think Gil's point is excellent in that oftentimes it takes an act of government to fund the first step. SpaceX, it would have been hard to imagine that the Falcon 1 rocket appearing with strictly commercial funding. The risk would have been too high. And Bush makes a similar point, about automotive technology say the government should come in and say, we'll buy, 15,000 cars with a unique type of power plant. I forget the exact example. Maybe he said it'd be a Stirling engine or something like that. And perhaps that's often what it takes to get us into a new area. Airliner style aircraft are largely the same design. In fact, sometimes literally the same design for the last half century. The 747 first flew in '69. And certainly they've upgraded the engines and similar things, but the basic technology is the same. And I think we could use a little bit more of that. But the question would be like, what should the government incentivize in this fashion?
Any thoughts on that? And I think we have two people with their hands up, Dominic and James.
Yeah, the point I was thinking about is kind of in relation to the mention of Elon Musk, is that I feel that in a lot of cases, for real paradigm changing innovation, it requires there to be someone who is willing to stand up and do something even when other people say it is impossible. And I feel that as a society, and perhaps particularly the education system, tends to raise people to think that they can only do the things that the system tells them is possible to do. And that in itself holds back innovation, because if you only do what the system tells you is possible, almost by definition, you're probably not going to do the paradigm changing things. And I think Musk was an example of someone who is willing to power on with something even though people tell him he can't do it. That can sometimes, of course, lead people down paths that maybe actually are not very good, but we may have to take the rough with the smooth, as the saying goes.
Jeremy?
To Dominic's point, I think we need some major revamp to our education system, which seems to be designed to, and I'm thinking sort of primary and secondary school, seems to be designed to make assembly line workers. Sort of weird combination of assembly line workers and also academics. We write papers in the style that academics write, about, why do I have to write an article about, critiquing, the Great Gatsby, for example? Could I not write about something that would be more useful to me? And, all through even, science and math training, for example, it's largely like, this is the way you solve this problem, instead of giving you a more, real world example, like take apart an engine, for example, and see how it works. I think that would be a lot more useful education for a lot more people. And I think, people draw, Bush even, I think, draws comparison to the education style in different countries where it's, often done by rote. And some people say the American system is better, but I think it's still a lot too rigidized and breeds sort of more conformism than innovation. Like anyone who innovates in the American school is kind of stamped down on, or thinks originally. That's at least my experience.
So Dominic and Parth, we'll invite you to chime in, and then we'll shift over more towards closing, where we'll ask everyone to bring, those who want to contribute, any other passages or themes from the book that they'd like to reflect on with the group. So yeah, Dominic, since you had your hand up first.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that quite a lot of what Jeremy said about the education system is pretty much exactly what I think also, that we have a set of school systems that are basically designed to turn people into assembly line workers, and indeed maybe that was primarily their point in the 19th century. And I mean, I have the experience of how I was educated at home and primarily ran my own education. I taught myself stuff, I learned how to learn, and I feel that has quite a lot of value. And I think, yes, that And then I went, because I am now in the process of completing a part-time university degree, and I certainly felt how it felt somehow they told you how to do everything. I felt like that was kind of a step back for me, even though what I had previously been studying for was a lower level of qualification. I felt that what happened at university was that they tell you how to do it all, and that felt like a step back.
Parth?
Yeah, really quickly, I just wanted to get the group's feedback on one idea that I've been thinking about, which is the idea of bottleneck analysis. So I just linked a really good blog post that describes, one version of what this could look like. But I think the hypothesis is that, in terms of this problem of mobilizing talented people against important problems, one of the things that holds people back is a clear analysis of, who is working on this problem, what are they doing, like what are the core bottlenecks that are holding things back. And then I think it was Michael Nielsen had a really good Twitter thread about the idea of vision papers. So also laying out, like what needs to happen in the world to make progress. It feels like, these exist and when, when they're shared, with the public, they're really useful. But most of the time, people create these vision papers, but then kind of hold them closely. So like VCs, when they're like forming an investment thesis for a space, or philanthropic institutions when they're like creating new programs out of fear of like reputational harm, maybe don't share them publicly. There's some good examples, like OpenPhil has started to publish their analysis of new problem areas that they're exploring. But I wonder, I guess the two specific questions are like, yeah, like to Ben's point about most of them being terrible, like how do you do this kind of analysis well? And then the second question is, are there specific problem or technology areas where you think this kind of like bottleneck and analysis and road mapping, the path forward would be particularly useful?
My really trite response is that I think answering that question is actually an open research area in and of itself.
There's some discussion, I think, maybe mostly popularized that by Balaji Srinivasan on tech trees. I find the kind of formulation of tech trees like maybe a little too specific for it to be useful, but I think the general idea is nice, where someone or some group of people sort of lay out a map of what sorts of maybe major breakthroughs would have to happen in order for us to like get to some like major goal for humanity, right? It's like we're trying to get to Mars, for instance, right? So what are the major breakthroughs that have to happen for us to be able to do that? And the idea is by making it legible, by putting it out there like in a form that people can then like critique, people can then also establish organizations that can work on one piece of the tree at a time. So the idea here being that you can get like VC funding or whatever for this. But, so I like the idea. I'm not sure. I think it's still to be seen just how practical or like how usable the thing is.
Any comments or thoughts on that? Parth, you still have your hand up, right?
Sorry, yeah, no, I just put it down.
Okay, so we've got around 10 or so minutes left. And of course, there's a lot in the book that we didn't get to touch on, and a lot more food for thought. So we wanted to invite the group, if anyone wants to pick out any passages or themes or open questions, just open reflection at this point. And yeah, just raise your hand if you'd like to share something with the group. Gil?
All right, so I wanted to comment on something in the book about automation. And there's a passage in there where he speaks about thinking that everything should be automated in a factory, and then meeting a person who seems to absolutely love their job doing something that is quite manual and repetitive. And then there's this really awful elitist statement that, well, maybe this is a good thing for people that can only do such things. And then immediately it flips to, but yet we should automate things in order to free people up, in order to think more. And it's just very hard. So what I came away with, and that's just one example, is that he was not a simple man. And I think that there is a lot of ambivalence, I guess is the right way to say it, in a lot of the positions that he held. And this one on automation in particular, I think shows the tension that was going on in his mind between what is typically these days the same, where Silicon Valley has a very fixed kind of utopian idea of how people should live and says, okay, let's build things for that world. And then suddenly we get brought up short when we realize that that's actually not a correct model of human beings, and that we live in a tiny little world with very large walls in it, and that actually the real world is very different than what we think, and that we have to start doing work for the real world. So I found it kind of refreshing, actually, to see him struggle with both sides of things as he talked about them. And throughout the whole book, sort of seeing this thing of, saying, well, on the one hand this, and on the other hand that. And I think it would be nice to see more books that are like that, where people don't just take a singular view of things, because usually that is wrong, and it's in the dialectic that we actually learn truth.
Yeah, along those lines, actually, I have a question for the progress studies people, which is there a side of progress studies that is looking at how people react to or like adapt to past progress, right? Suppose that progress studies is successful and we learn how to build things, right? Like how to automate the production of things very quickly. Then what happens to the people who are most adversely affected by that? Seems like there should be like a like a progress of like human catch up too or something, right? That's a part of progress studies. Ben, you want to respond?
Well, I raised my hand in response to Gil, which is actually sort of a question. I agree with you that I really like the dialectic, and I wish more things were like that. So almost the question is like, how does one, if you're not already Vannevar Bush, where everybody takes you seriously because you did all those things, how do you? I find that people don't take things as seriously, or like when you sort of portray, when you say like, well, like this might not work, or it's like I'm thinking about this or this, people don't take that as seriously because they're like, oh, you're like clearly not committed, you're not focused. And so I guess like the ultimate question for the group is like, how do you do that well? How do you have like a culture that embraces that? I apologize for going back, Leslie, but I think the point about the dialectic is really important.
Let me quickly sort of add onto that. I think that Ben is very much right. There is hope though. So I think outside of the academic world, where no one wants to show the mistakes that they made or the negative results that they got or things like that. And I know this is a topic of a lot of discussion, how to be more honest about what didn't work, right, in papers. If you look on YouTube videos about plumbing, you'll see a variety of people who are pros in the field, and the good ones actually talk about when they mess up, and you get to see it. And so maybe if we kind of get off the pedestal here and sort of look to some people who like to put stuff out there on the web in other fields, we'll actually learn something. So, follow the plumbers.
Any other observations from the group that from the book that you all would like to touch on or share with the group or ask questions about?
I just wanted to mention like one fun gadgety thing that he talked about. You know, there's a lot of discussion of like various technologies and gadgets. The DUKW, the duck vehicle, the whole passage about, so it's page 118, like there's a whole section about how the thing came into being and like how the army didn't want it because the army like at the time really wanted to be the ones that were building like their own vehicles. Yeah, you know, like it's a very like entertaining story and like right, like about how they got that thing adopted. But if you're ever in the Boston area, there's this thing called the duck tour, which starts on land and then goes in the water, and it like drives around in the Charles, and they let the kids go and drive the boat too. It's very entertaining. Those boats are pretty good replicas of the World War II vehicles. So I highly recommend it. Yeah, it's always a fun touristy thing to do. Are there any other technologies that people found fun or interesting from the book? Jeremy?
So he devotes the majority of the chapter to like discussion of automotive engines, and in particular like alternatives to the standard internal combustion engine. It says various alternatives would have been better. We should have explored this or that, whether it be turbine engines or the rotary engine, or maybe it's mostly nostalgia, but it's steam car, had a Stanley steamer. And I was, not knowing an awful lot about the practicality of the alternatives. So I was wondering if anyone thought that maybe we could have gone differently and would have been better off exploring, investing more R&D time in these alternative engines.
So I will try to answer that. If there's any field that has had huge amounts of money integrated over time put into it, it's automotive engines. And I think the problem that we have now is not the engine technology, but what to do with the results of the combustion of the fuel that comes out, or whether to use the fuel at all. So I think that a huge amount of effort went into that. The best engines today are approximately 40% thermally efficient, which is remarkably high. Incredibly inexpensive and amazingly long lasting. Is there something better? I'm sure that there is, but it's only going to be a little bit better. And so the question is, where's the best place to put our resources now? And almost all of the car companies are drastically shifting resources from engine R&D into other sorts of things. Batteries being first and foremost of all of that.
Yeah, and certainly I would agree that the way forward is electric, and that's possibly the most anachronistic part of the book is where he talks about batteries and says, oh, lead acid batteries are a terrible solution for a vehicle, and they are because they're very heavy. And he says, what if we had lighter batteries? Well, now we have them, and that's like the obvious way forward, but it's interesting for me at least to look back and think, well, could we have done better from in the 20th century?
So if you just look at patents, or there's lots of other places that you can look, but because engines are so physical, and you can just look at them you can look at the parts with your eyes, you can understand how they work and things like that. I think that it's actually a field where actually we've done very, very well, and we have a lot to be proud of. It just happens that the Earth doesn't like so much CO2 in the air, and it's sort of hard to see where to go beyond that. But we're definitely way out on the curve there, and I don't think that it's mostly mined out, is what I'm trying to say, right? That if you think about R&D like mining, that particular kind of ore is mostly mined out. But there's so many other things that we need to focus on now. And I don't think it could have been that much better. There were a lot of really neat things that were tried. And the capital required to try them was not that large versus a lot of the things that we're talking about now. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, Chrysler tried turbine car, for example, and I think it was, an interesting artifact of history, but I think they'd shown that it was impractical for a number of reasons, high manufacturing costs and high fuel burn. Yeah.
Great. So I think what we'll do now is we'll go ahead and officially close the salon and stop the recording. And then if people want to continue to hang out, that's totally okay. I'll stay on for a bit. But yeah, we'd like to thank everybody for coming on this Saturday.
I was muted. Thanks for the great discussion and for joining us.